We're going to start off with Anders Ruhwald, who is a sculptor and installation artist whose practice is grounded in ceramics. He lives and works between Detroit and Chicago, and now Oslo, and received his MFA from the Royal College of Art in London in 2005. He has exhibited extensively all around the world, and his work is represented in over 20 public collections internationally, including the Victoria and Albert Museum in the UK, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Denver Art Museum, Musée des Arts Décoratifs, France, and so on. In 2011, he was awarded the Gold Prize at the Icon Biennial in South Korea, as well as receiving a Danish Art Foundation 3-year work stipendium in 2010. He also was awarded the Sotheby's Prize in 2007. He is now a professor at the ceramics at the National Academy of Arts in Oslo. Welcome to Ruhwald.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to get myself some water here. It's really lovely. I should speak into the microphone, right? It's really lovely to be back here in Oslo again, and to be back in Norway as well. I've had this long relationship with both Bergen, Trondheim, and Oslo, so I was really excited to get the offer to come to Kio to teach for the next 4 years as a visiting artist, professor, or whatever it's called. We just concluded the workshop yesterday with a bunch of lovely students and had kind of an amazing time. So I just want to thank everybody for kind of welcoming me back in such a lovely way, and particularly to Carolina for inviting me to the position here. And so it's lovely to be here. Today I wanted to address the question of the question with a question. Through basically just thinking about space, and so what I'll do is to talk through 2 exhibitions, basically, or 2 sort of installations / exhibitions, but begin it just by introducing my practice kind of more broadly. I'm going to be reading most of it out as well, just in order to get it all in there, but here it goes. When I begin to formulate a new body of work, the first thing that I consider is the space that the work will exist in. I'm of the understanding that an object inhabits a space, it derives some meaning from it, and that the meaning of an object will change when situated in a different place. The link between a given space and the objects that I create is therefore at the center of my thinking. This thinking was one that has developed from the point when I was first introduced to ceramics and was consumed by making thrown objects meant for use. And so, like Morten, I also have a background in pottery. I was not as technically trained as Morten was, but that was kind of how I got into making ceramics. The way I was working, I always considered the utility and the form of the object simultaneously, and one would have to inform the other. I was not necessarily led by the old dictums of which should follow the other, but that the two were always there, present at the same time. In this way, my background as a potter is one where the idea of an object always comes with that of a concrete context. Sometimes this context is a place, and other times it's an action with which the object performs. I'm pointing this out to establish the fact that the objects that I do are not to be understood as singular contained entities. As best, the objects that I do bleed into the space, and as a consequence, the space also bleeds into the objects and changes accordingly. And this piece is actually now in the National Museum. It was acquired a couple of years ago when I had an exhibition here in Oslo, so I was really, really excited that that lives here too now, and might come out of storage at some point. As an extension, what occurs in the adjacent galleries or rooms are equally important and will inform the reading of the objects. How one meets the objects is important, but what informs this meeting and precedes is equally so. The object itself is never on its own, never contained. Instead, the work is conditioned by the space that it exists within, the objects that are around it, and the people that experience it. So just to explain, this is a kind of it's an exhibition space at the Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, and this is like a perfect cube that's 10 by 10 by 10 meters. And so we clad the sort of whole interior with this brass mirror in order to make the audience kind of see themselves reflected in the work. I spent as much time configuring the placement of the works and construction of the exhibition as I do making the objects that inhabit it. I'm extremely conscious of the structures that inform the experience of the gallery and the museum, and try to work with and against them to achieve the desired sense of space. Therefore, the history of the space often comes into play as I begin to define how to engage with it. By history, I mean not only former users of the space or the history of the building, but also how gallery assistants might navigate the space, how previous exhibitions were hung, or what spaces audience might be coming through before they meet my work. All of these considerations feed into how the audience experience the space and what they expect to see. In my work, these histories are possibilities to play around with, like a set of expectations that can either be highlighted or denied. The space is in a sense as much part of the work as the objects that I place there. But the relation between the two is not continuous and stable. I'm not interested in the idea of site specificity or fixed notions of installation. The work that I do is driven by the idea that the object will change meaning and as the physical surroundings do, and importantly, that this change is productive. I'll often exhibit the same body of work in different contexts and in changing configurations. Sometimes I'll mix pieces from several exhibitions together into one to arrive at a new meaning and change the nature of the individual object. To me, this is a key part of what I do and an important aspect of the objects that I create. Naturally, some objects are more flexible than others, and as I show the work several times, sorry, I just gotta scroll through the text here. I think I set up my slideshow and I just changed over from an old PowerPoint to a new PowerPoint. I don't know how to scroll. I can't find my cursor. Sorry, just 2 seconds, otherwise I can't continue reading here. You'll just get to see everything here. I think if I do like this. Naturally, some objects are more flexible than others. And as I show the same work several times, some pieces find new meaning. Much of this interplay hinges on the objects themselves, and by focusing on space and how they are situated, I mainly aim to make a point of the consideration that goes into the placement and the relationship to context. So that was the first part of the talk. I'll dive into two installations that I've done, both of which are in Detroit, in Michigan, in America. One is at the Cranbrook Art Museum, which is a place where I lived I lived at a place called Cranbrook Academy of Art, but it has an art museum as well. And so I lived very close to the house that I'll be showing images from here for about 9 years. And this exhibition basically deals with what is a kind of a house museum now that was built by Eliel Saarinen, so the father of Eero Saarinen, who you probably know a little better, in Michigan as kind of a model home for his architecture and also for his family. The first piece of the intervention tries to deal with the specifics in the setup of the house that we're presented with. Having served as a residence for various directors at Cranbrook until the late 80s, the Saarinen house has been changed over significantly through the years. The house that we now visit the house that we visit now is not a house that was presented in the state that was left when lawyer Saarinen moved out of Cranbrook after Eliel's death in 1950. Instead, the house is brought back to a time a couple of years after the Saarinen family moved in and had finished up most of the details of the interior. It's a reconstruction made carefully from photographs, written accounts, and interviews. Sorry, I still don't have my text kind of working well here. I'm really sorry. Huh? Oh, I need to go. Thank you. I'm double screening. That's why. Perfect. Thank you. It's a reconstruction carefully made from photographs, written accounts, and interviews. Hereby, it's a house that pretends to be frozen in the state that it was during the mid-1930s, but really it's an account of what a set of art historians in the early 1990s were able to unearth about the original state. The interior that we are presented with is an assembly of objects arranged in a reconstructed interior made in the 1990s to represent the mid-1930s for people in 2018 to experience. So it's this kind of folded time, right? This kind of idea that we're sort of presented with a historical kind of reconstruction that is imagined, 20 years ago or something like that. The first piece in the intervention is this bowl. Placed in the dining room table, it aims to illustrate the sense of time being folded onto itself. It's essentially a bit of ceramic drama played out on the lip of a bowl to represent the state. The gravitational pull is reversed and the motion is frozen. It's a way of representing a sort of cinematic time where the linear progression of events give way for a different construct of time and how we perceive it. The placement on the table also suggests one of the dominant themes of the intervention, that which has to do with the relationship between the father and the son of the house, between Eero and Eliel. The placemat that the bowl is sitting on is one of the first known designs by Eero Saarinen. He made a set of block-printed placemats at the age of 10, and as you go through the house, you'll see a lineage of objects created by Eero that get increasingly ambitious as he gets older. By looking into these objects, it seems as if Eliel almost had a sort of system of schooling set up for his son. Small tabletop objects, then furniture, then buildings, then campuses. And I think this quote that's up there kind of illustrates that. As I began working with this intervention, it became almost impossible not to question the relationship between the father and the son, and how much of the son's later success was a result of a very specific and directed bit of homeschooling. I should probably add at the same time that I just had a son at the same time, so these were questions that were very present in my mind. Jokingly, I suggested a somewhat less complicated narrative on Eero's artistic evolution, but as I began to dive into the history of the family, it seemed as if there was more to this story. I therefore included this lamp and placed it in the library. The lamp thus becomes a take on the parental relationship in the family, and a question towards the largely positive narrative about the evolution of Eero Saarinen's artistic development. But the lamp and the vessel also outline a certain sensitivity to a specific object category. I quite purposely chose these two object typologies to underline the aim to resolve the intervention conceptual framework within the history and typology of design and decorative arts. And so the lamp is called Lamp and Gottlieb's Gaze, and so Gottlieb is the middle name of Eliel Saarinen, and so it's a kind of idea of the stern eye of the father that kind of guides the son. I aim to make objects that could be read as decorative, or objects that at least try to speak the same language as the majority of the things that occupy the house already, namely that of designed and/or craft objects. So it's really this idea of sort of making objects that fit into the house, but could also begin to contextualize the whole house at the same time, that they would speak the language of decorative arts. Hereby, most of the intervention literally sit on other objects in the house, and thus try to integrate the conditions of the house while adding comments to the rooms and its previous inhabitants. This piece, called Crystal Ball, The Future, is thus placed on the so-called studio alcove, which sits in one of the in one end of what was the architectural office of Eliel Saarinen. The alcove served as an in-between space between the domestic and the workplace, and it was a place where the Saarinens would entertain clients and students. The piece itself was a simple conflation of two things: the pedestal base of Eero Saarinen's line of pedestal furniture, mostly known as the tulip chair, designed in 1955 and 65, of 55 and 56, sorry. A crystal ball used by seers to tell fortunes and predict the future. It's a piece questioning how the future was imagined in the past. The two architects, Eliel and Eero, sit at either end of the modern spectrum, and embedded into their designs are many of the strains of thinking that identify the modern era, and a faith to design to resolve the problems of the day. Any of the rooms, in the house, the alcove was was the social space where these thoughts and ideas could be floated, discussed, and casually expanded upon. Cranbrook itself remains an expression of some of these utopian ideals, but also is a case study of some of its failure. Placed on the outskirts of Detroit, one of America's most complicated and dysfunctional cities, Cranbrook remains largely intact and embedded into an affluent suburb that has grown around it. While it calls itself an educational community, it lacks the basic amenities that constitute any community, such as shops, public transportation, etc., and might only have remained intact because of the monastic isolation that results from it. It stands as a shrine to an era that saw the boom and the rapid decline of the amazing city of Detroit, which Cranbrook sits so closely to, but is also so oddly moved from. At the other end of the same room, this piece called The Flight of the Crane is placed. This place is a collaboration between myself and my mom, Trine, or Trine, as we say. It's funny how you begin to kind of change names that you only know in one language. An accomplished amateur weaver. This is actually where I'm going tonight. This is my parents' house in Tranum, in North Jutland. The title is a play on some of the coincidences that made the piece come about. In the late 1970s, my parents ventured to build a house outside of the city of Tranum in North Jutland. The place name Tranum means the home of the crane, and Cranbrook means crane marsh, or a marsh frequented by cranes in Old English. Loya Saarinen, the collaborator and wife of Eliel Saarinen, remains one of the most influential weavers in America to this day. And Saarinen House stands as much as a museum of her textiles as it does of Eliel's architecture. So this is a historical image from the architectural studio, and so those you do see some of the models of Eliel Saarinen in front of the weaves of Loya Saarinen, and as you go through the campus there, you'll really kind of see this full integration between, you know, one of the things that I think are often kind of lost in the whole discussion of modernism, how craft and craft objects were a large part of the interiors of those places. My mother Trine has woven all the curtains for the house in North Jutland, as had Loya Saarinen for Saarinen House, making a collaboration with my mom that seemed to be a simple way to acknowledge some of the more complicated issues surrounding upbringing, inheritance, and regional specificity as it applies to the crafts. Through this, I didn't suppose any sort of comparison, only that there's a specific strain of modernism in Scandinavia that the Saarinens brought to the US, and which might have drawn me to the house as well. This strain has a heavy affinity to traditional crafts, which is evident throughout the house. My mom and I chose to work thematically with the green hue of the room and the octagonal form that is repeated throughout the Saarinen buildings at Cranbrook. So here's some of those. As such, the collaboration sifts through some of the formal strains of the early modern language that the Saarinens or Eliel Saarinen represent. The pedestal is a nod to some of Eliel's classical influences, while my mom's weave play up the formal qualities of the kind of modern weaving that the school of Loya Saarinen came to represent in America. The metal scaffold that holds up the weave is directly lifted from the chairs that line the room. These chairs are some of the first attempts at furniture designed by Eero Saarinen. I think he made these chairs or designed these chairs when he was 12 or something like that. The upstairs of the Saarinen house is essentially the private quarters of the house. It consists only of bathrooms, a small sitting room, and a bedroom that is kept outside of the public eye while the Saarinens lived there. In the upstairs linen closet, I placed 5 lumps of glazed ceramics, each similar to the shape of a folded towel. Inside the cabinet, the inside of the cabinet is painted blue, which is an old household trick to make the whites appear whiter. The piece called Fade to White. The piece is called Fade to White, which is a title I borrowed from the Swedish musician B.J. Nilsson from his album of the same name, where he used electronically altered field recordings from domestic spaces, which he made into compositions. Throughout the sign and house, each of the rooms has a distinct yet subtle color scheme, which attunes the inhabitants to the ambience of the individual spaces in an almost homeopathic way. So you have the kind of warm glow of the dining room, the sort of intimate, cozy kind of space, and the green of the alcove, and so on and so forth. The sort of blue morning light that goes into the corner down there, which is where the signants would eat their breakfast in the morning. In the cabinet, each of these 5 lumps were glazed in a slight gradient of white going from warm to cold. The experience of the gradient is cancelled out by the blue hue of the cabinet and is almost invisible to the eye. As such, I hope that it would operate similar to the way that the colors of the house influence the visitors when they come to experience each of the rooms. The outside courtyard was one of the most revered spaces in the summertime for the Seinen family. As most Scandinavians, they would seek the sun when winter gave way to summer. The courtyard thus became a place for sunbathing and socializing. To activate this space, I chose to remake 2 Alvar Aalto designs, one a deck chair originally made for, and I'm going to butcher this, Carolina, I'm sorry, Villa Marina? What do you call the summer house, the Aalto summer house? Maida, sorry. In Norrmakku, is that okay? Norrmakku. Yeah. It's the first time I've ever had a Finnish person in the audience when I've been giving those lectures. It's kind of scary. And the iconic Savoy vase made in the hotel of the same name. Aalto himself visited the Saarinen at Cranbrook only once, but its architectural practice seems like an obvious link between Eliel Saarinen and his son Eero. By simply remaking and placing the 2 sets of objects, I wanted to evoke Aalto as a bridge between the 2. In the remake of the design, I chose to overemphasize the crafted aspects of the making. As such, both objects have clear markings of the making to the point where the marks become ornamental. This was done to highlight some of the tooling and crafting that went into those early modern designs. Often made in small shops by skilled craftsmen, these designs were highly reliant on technology from the previous century. So I'm kind of interested in this idea that, you know, in order to kind of create modernism, really the sort of the tools that were made to do that were the technologies of the previous centuries often. And hereby the link between production, product, leisure, craft all seem to be coming together, bridging some of the old with some of the new. The intervention finishes in the master bedroom adjacent to the upstairs, in the master bathroom adjacent to the upstairs master bedroom. Most of the furniture in the bedroom was designed by Eero Saarinen for his parents, which is really kind of odd. So the painting that is there is of lawyer Saarinen's father, and you know, overlooking 2 beds which are split. And then the kid has done all the furniture. It's like such a crazy house. When you start sort of deconstructing it psychologically. In the bathroom, I chose to place the last object in the house. What we know of Eero Saarinen's work is mostly conceived in a very short time span of about 11 years from the time of his father's death in 1950. And I quote, "I often contributed with the technical solutions and plans, but only within the concept of my father. A better name for an architect is a form giver, and until his death in 1950, when I started creating my own form, I worked within the form of my father. Unimaginable for an artist and designer now, Eero Saarinen, despite his superior talent, worked for his father in a subdued role until released from this task at the age of 40 when Eliel died. And so, and as the story will have it, the day after Eliel passed, he filed for a name change of the architectural practice from Saarinen, Swanson and Associates to Eero Saarinen and Associates. He shelved all the unrealized projects that they were working on and set out to change the direction of the architectural office. So obviously there must have been some discord between the 2. The piece called The School of the Flower, which is in the bathroom, takes the cue from Eros Eliel Sainen's book, The Search for Form in Art and Architecture, in which he lists 4 references for form and design, one of them being the flower. And I really do not recommend that you read this book. It's super boring, but it was a good kind of good way to get into kind of figuring out what I wanted to do with this piece. I wanted to use the idea of this idea as a metaphor for the schooling of Eero by his father. In order to do so, I utilized the formal language of the mid-century ceramic artist Axel Salto, who famously worked in 2 styles, the sprouting and the budding style, which you see examples of here. For this piece, I replicated and overemphasized the budding style, and by placing the piece in the bathroom, I wanted to make sure that the psychological undertones were not missed. The base of the piece functions as another pointer. Essentially, they're remade versions of Bruno Madsen's Jetson chair. Madsen himself was also trained by his father, and by including these bases, I wanted to give an added suggestion of the paternal training that both Bruno Madsen and Eero Sainen are examples of. So the intervention at the Saarinen house is therefore no attempt to say anything conclusive about the family as such. It's largely a subjective and somewhat argumentative way of approaching the house and the family. Hereby I aimed only to add further layers to the experience of the place and question some of the construction of the formal arrangement of the house and the objects that occupy it seem to suggest. As such, it is as much an image of the questions I had to my own life and the place where I lived at the point when I was making the work for the intervention, as it is an explicit statement about the Saarinen family and the house museum that represents them now. So that was the second part of what I wanted to talk, and I just wanted to conclude today with another Detroit-based project, which is this one that's called Unit 13583 Du Bois, which is still going on. I'm sorry to say, because it has been going on for 4 years now, and I really want to be done. But it may be coming very soon. But this project is all happening within this building here, which is a building that I bought in Detroit about 5 years ago now. For the purposes of making this installation. Just to sort of explain a little bit about Detroit, this is what it looks like from Google Maps. And as you can see, it looks like a fairly beautiful green city. But when you start kind of looking in a little further, you'll start noticing the reason for it being so green. Which mainly has to do with large parts of the city having been torn down or in the process of falling apart, basically. So 71 or 2170 Mac, which is kind of a wrong address for the places where it's at. What has happened in this neighborhood? What you have to imagine here is that there used to be a density of the houses, what you see kind of just under the search bar there, like at least like 20 houses on each block. And what it's looking like now is that there just fields left. So most of the houses in this whole area has been torn down as a consequence of a number of factors, but something that's kind of unimaginable in a sort of Scandinavian context, I guess, in particular. The reason for the sort of mess up of the address, the actual address now legally is 2170 Mac, but when I deal with like post office and water and utilities and all that kind of stuff, then it's 3583 Du Bois Street. And this is simply just because of all the houses that have been torn down. There are no addresses left on Du Bois Street, even though that is a street in and of itself and the street where this building lies upon. But for efficiency of the city, they've just canceled out all those addresses, which is kind of insane in and of itself. So this is what it looks like from the roof of the building. So there's only, this house is now also torn down, the White House that's right there. The red-green house over there is still standing. But this is kind of what we have left in the neighborhood. When I talk to people who used to live there, this used to be a really active and full neighborhood of people. But over the last 20, 30 years, people started moving out, and then eventually they started tearing down the whole area. So this is kind of the condition you see a lot in Detroit, which are houses that are beginning to kind of fall down. Most of them are timber frame structures, and so as a result, after 15, 20 years, the frames start giving in as they get exposed to the cold in the winter and the heat of the summer. It really works on them, and then eventually the houses kind of collapse either on themselves or like this, which is another issue that happens in Detroit, that of either houses being burnt down kind of by mistake, of people trying to keep themselves warm in the wintertime. Or through arson, which also has happened a whole lot, but fortunately it's not happening so much. The building that I bought, just so you understand, kind of looked like this on the inside. It needed a lot of work, and as a result, we got it for next to nothing, less than you buy a car for in America. But it is a 4-apartment building block, basically. And so, in order to make this exhibition, I made a couple of exhibitions in other places as a way of kind of thinking about it. For the first time, I knew I was ending up doing something that would be site-specific and that would have a duration for a very long time. The idea is that once this installation opens up, it'll be open as long as I can afford to have it open, basically. And so I wanted to make sure what I did in there was something that I felt that I had kind of tested out. And I've always been fortunate enough to have a lot of exhibitions. And so I started using the exhibitions as a way of sort of figuring out what I wanted to do with the installation in a way. So I guess this is another way of kind of asking questions, is a way how you can kind of utilize spaces and think about conceptual issues while actually kind of making exhibitions at the same time. And so I had the opportunity to show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland, and these are the only images I have of the installation so far. I basically built out most of the installation, spare 2 rooms inside this. So when you come into the gallery at MoCA Cleveland, you basically come into a white room and you're faced with this door. And that's the front door from, I guess, this is the front door for the installation as you meet it inside the building. So we took pretty much all the interior of the installation and brought it down to the museum. And so you step into this kind of darkened surrounding, and this is what it looks like on the inside. I can't see anything because that bloody light is so sharp. So can you see, sometimes these images kind of disappear, but it looks like you can see it, right? Yeah, okay, cool. So the first thing that you see when you come in is this photograph that's on the wall. Most people actually miss it when they come through the installation now, which is kind of intentional. This is the only found personal object from the house that I'm using in the installation. So it's I figured out when I did some image research on it, it's an image from a place called Diamond Head in Hawaii, where I've never been. But when I opened up the frame, there was a small inscription that said 2641, which basically means that it most likely was either printed or taken on February 6th on 1941. So about half a year before Pearl Harbor hit. And I wanted to kind of bring in the image just as a simple nod to sort of one of the complications of Detroit's history. As you may know, Detroit, during the Second World War, they turned all of the auto industry. Detroit is Motown, right? It's a motor city. It's where all cars in America were made originally. It was where Henry Ford made the Model T and so on and so forth. There's this long automotive history. And so during the Second World War, they turned all of these auto manufacturers into manufacturers for weapons, basically to fight in Europe and Asia. And so I wanted to have this kind of nod to that whole history. Most likely the person who lived in this building, who we don't know who actually kind of inhabited the places. Outside of their names, we don't know anything about them. We bought it off a lawyer. But most likely was stationed there. Somebody in the house was stationed out there because back in those days, you didn't just jump a plane to Hawaii from Detroit. It's about an 8-hour plane ride nowadays. So I don't know how long it would have taken back in 41. So it's a way of kind of beginning to suggest a kind of a complicated issue of the city's relationship to industry. This sort of idea that industry is the thing that fed them, but as the auto industry started going down in Detroit, it's also what has caused the whole city to kind of crumble on itself. And so this kind of dual relationship to industry, which I think is similar to what Morten was talking about as well. This kind of the complication of jobs disappearing and with it, manufacturing and so on. So this is the entrance hallway as it looks now, and actually also looks in the house in Detroit now. This is all installed in there. So in the ceiling, there are all these window counterweights, which are in American windows. You have cast iron weights that hang on the windows through some string, basically to kind of counterlift the windows as they go up and down. And because of all the buildings that have been torn down, there was a local place that fixes up windows, and they had about 800 of these lying about, which I then got off them. So there are about 400 of these hanging up there, which is about, I think, 2 metric tons of cast iron. And so it has this kind of looming presence as you go in. All the walls are charred wood, and so we basically kind of burned down all of the sort of all the walls by taking them out and then reconstructing them in plywood and other types of wood, and then also charring all the doors and everything else. And then there's just a simple candle, and all that illuminates this room is just a single candle. In the next room, the whole interior is clad in lead, and you're then met with this ceramic object here, which is a kind of a way of thinking about energy as this kind of metaphorical thing. And so it's basically similar to a lamp, but the lampshade is made out of ceramic, and so there is a 150-watt light bulb in there that heats up the piece, but the light does not come out. The only thing that comes out is heat. And so as you pass this object, you kind of feel a slight sense of sort of the warmth of the object as you go through. And then there's this kind of crazy material density that happens when you're in a room that's fully clad with lead. It's a very small room as well. It's the images are a little kind of twisted like that. The room in itself is octagonal, and one of the ways that I work is that you can always find a little bit of the previous exhibition that I've done, and so the octagon kind of relates back to the piece that I did together with my mom, but also to a kind of a nod to sort of Detroit modernism, I guess, through Eliel Seinen. So here's a look through the installation. And then you get into the next room, which basically looks like this. So as we were pulling down most of the interior in the building, in America, when you make walls, you use what's called lath, which is thin pieces of pine that will then hold up the plaster in order to create a wall. And so we were pulling out all of these sticks of pine that we then chose to kind of reconstruct the interior in this room with, and so it looks like this. It's thin slivers of charred wood. On the wall, there's an object that is kind of functioning as a painting, I guess, in a way. It's a sheet of ceramics that has then been fired with all the leftovers from the reconstruction of this room. So little scraps of wood that fired in a saga firing that then turns the ceramic black. And then when you get a little closer to it, you might see that it's kind of filled in with gold in this kind of old school Japanese way of mending something that is broken and putting it back together, and at least in Japanese culture is understood to be even more precious. I always like to have objects that are very kind of literal, so the stool is just a stool that you can sit on, and similarly the radiator is just a radiator. And so I like to have objects that kind of go from being both metaphorical to being just what they are. Because relating back to the idea of where I come from as an artist and being a potter, there is always this kind of relationship between a very simple kind of usage of things, and then the sort of more metaphorical aspects of pottery as you kind of start to think about it and start to think about its relationship to history and you know, our development as human beings. And some of the objects I don't really explain, so this one I won't explain. But I like to have things that kind of hang around as question marks. So relative to the kind of question, this is a question, and I don't know the answer to this question. And I think, you know, to a large extent, if my question is anything, it's really what Kjell said is like, you know, when I have a bit of clay, it becomes a question. So a further view into the room, and you come into this room here, which I call the library, just out of sort of the way that it functions. And so it's a paneled room, again, with charred wood, and is totally filled up with these objects. They're about this high or something like that, made in ceramic with a little glass ball on top of it. The way that I see them functioning is that they take up space. And kind of carry a space that you can't get into or get close to in some sort of way. And so as you go through the room, you kind of have to navigate these objects. They are very tight in there, and they become these kind of physical blockers in some sort of way. And then they're tilted in this kind of paneled room, but the panels in themselves kind of take the dimension of a traditional American city plot as well. So it has a kind of relationship to the architectural space of the outside. And then the last room here is the bathroom. And I'll just show you a quick video here to give you a sense of what's going on and how that materiality came about. So this is a YouTube video taken in, I think, 2011 or 13 or something like that. This is a photograph from the Windsor side, or the Canadian side.
Yes, but it's not going
Detroit
anywhere.
is right next to Canada, and so the black clouds that you see there is the material that I used to cover that whole bathroom. It's basically a substance that comes out of petroleum refining, or when you're making gasoline for cars. There's this one material that's called pet coke, which is was stored along the river in Detroit and ended up being this like really heavy pollutant of the area, as you can see here, in the way that it was circled all over the city, and a lot of people that live down in this area, which is called the Southwest, are suffering from asthma and a lot of other things. But because of the inefficiencies of the Detroit government, this was just around the time when Detroit went through bankruptcy. There weren't really any regulation that was kind of helping out the people that were living there. And so what I chose to do for the last room of the installation in the show here was to cover all of the interiors of the bathroom with this material here, which is a really kind of beautiful substance in and of itself, and also has this sort of effect that you can't really see the outlines of anything that you're looking at. And so they become these sort of super saturated, super dense, kind of beautiful, but also very sort of unsettling in some sort of way objects that sit within the bathroom and looks exactly like a bathroom. So that's basically it for what I wanted to show you here today, relative to how I think about space, I guess. This is just if you want to do a little more looking at what I do. So thank you.